and for you to share if you have an interest in doing that. We'll also have the slides available later on our website. We'll post both the link to the webinar and also the slides. This webinar series is part of our work around training practitioners in the field around network leadership. It's part of our series that we'll put on this spring that will also go on for the rest of the year. It's all part of our Network Leadership Training Academy. Our Network Leadership Webinar Series and our Network Leadership Training Academy is really focused on helping practitioners build, manage, and evaluate effective networks. So really helping people who are on the ground working on building partnerships and collaborations, especially intersectorally across organizations. Which we know many people today are involved in those kinds of networks. We're trying to help folks like that build those kinds of skills that they need to actually be successful at that work. We know that finding information and tools to do that work is not as available as we would hope. So this is an opportunity to learn more about the research and the skills and the practices for engaging in what we call the network way of working. These networks are based on the premise that everyone involved in a network requires network leadership skills that apply to ongoing everyday work. So what we mean by that is that you don't have to be the leader of a network to have network leadership skills. We think that just being a member of a network means that you're a part of it, you're contributing something, and so it is helpful to always have the skills and thinking around that. So we have a list of upcoming webinars. So today we are so thrilled to welcome Blythe Butler, who I'll introduce in just a minute, to present a webinar on network leadership for collective impact. And on February 18th, actually I'll be leading a webinar on evaluating networks for network impact. We'll be posting a few more for the spring and then again even for the fall, and so stay tuned for those. We'll keep folks on the list to let people know what's going on. And just one last thing I wanted to point out before I do introduce Blythe. On the next slide, we have information about our Network Leadership Training Academy. The Network Leadership Training Academy is our annual event. It's going to be our 4th year. Every year we welcome about 60 to 70 people who come from all over the country and sometimes around the world to work together for 3 days on building these kinds of skills, working together, learning from each other, and engaging in activities to do network leadership work. So if you want more information about that, we have the link here. We'll be opening registration next week. The exciting thing about this year is that we have so many people who have come in the past who want to keep coming. So this year, for them and for others, we're adding the first day of the training is actually going to be our research symposium. So we're inviting more academic types and evaluators from around the country who are doing work to collect any kind of data or evaluation work around networks that informs practice, that informs the way that we build, manage, and evaluate these networks. So we're inviting submissions for papers and posters for that day, and would love to have folks who are interested check out the website, look at the research symposium link, and consider joining us. It's our inaugural year for that, and we'd love to see some really diverse participation from both the practice and academic community to come together to really talk about the data and research behind that. The following 2 days of our workshop focus a lot more on hands-on skill building and exercises and things of that sort. But we have excellent trainers and a really exciting agenda for this year. So please check us out, and we hope to see lots of folks like you at an event like that. So without further ado, I'd like to present today Blythe Butler. She's going to be presenting a webinar on network leadership for collective impact. So just on a personal note, I know Blythe because she came to one of our Network Leadership Training Academies. We met her there, and she's just a fantastic person. One of the things that always struck me as the most interesting is her title of her job is actually Network Weaver for the first 2,000 Days Network in Calgary. You know, just to say a little bit more about Blythe and what's here on the screen, she's really a passionate and principled leader with a focus on leading organizational learning, development, and change processes to strengthen human systems surrounding issues, and with a purpose to create cultures that support adaptive learning. She really has a broad and diverse background in things like strategic planning, change management, and organizational development, and is really an accomplished facilitator and stakeholder engagement practitioner. I've seen her work with her network, and she really does do all of these things. She has about 15 years experience and even more in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, including recent roles in community investment, corporate social responsibility, social enterprise, and change management. And one of the things Blythe is really known for is taking a multidisciplinary approach to develop strategies that address complex challenges, and then taking those strategies and translating them into practice. Just a few more things about Blythe's experience. For about 9 years, she's been contributing to the ongoing development, design, and delivery of Leadership Calgary. That's Canada's leading edge community development leadership team. She's also a board member of the Human Venture Institute and the past chair of the Leadership Calgary Program Committee and a past board member for Volunteer Calgary. An interesting fact about Blythe, in 2008, she was named to Calgary's top 40 under 40 for her career achievements and contributions to the community. Really kind of an amazing thing. She holds a bachelor's in communication and finance and international development from the University of Alberta and has studied journalism at Carleton University and design marketing at Parsons in New York City. So she is about as diverse as the networks that most of us are engaged in, and for that, she is a very interesting and skilled presenter. And we're just thrilled to welcome you today, Blythe, and I'm going to hand it over now. I'm just going to have one last comment. Blythe will speak for a little while. We have a question and answer box that you should see at the bottom of your screen. At any time, go ahead and ask, put some questions in there. At a point in the end of the presentation, we'll leave some time to answer those questions, so I'll facilitate a Q&A session while Blythe presents. And Blythe is also going to be doing some polls during the presentation, so stay tuned for that. And so at this point, I'll turn it over to Blythe and say thank you for doing this today, and it's all yours.
Great, thank you, Danielle. It's interesting to hear your own bio sometimes, and I hope I can live up to all of that in this short time. So thank you for that, and big thank you to Danielle and Sarah and Melinda and Darren, who Danielle's mentioned. We've had the pleasure to work with from a putting actually theory into practice perspective. We worked with the team at the University of Denver, Colorado, to conduct a network analysis on the first 2,000 days network. So if any of you are interested in our experience in that, I'd be more than pleased to talk in more detail about our program and our project with them. But today we're going to be talking about everything that you thought you signed up for, which was learnings from merging both network theory and collective impact approaches. And I have a little bit of a story arc through here, but we do want to leave time for questions at the end, because I think the value of webinars is not just an information dump, but also an opportunity to hear from others to the extent that we can. So I'll go through these. As Danielle said, the slides will be available after, so you'll have more chance to sort of dig into them at a later date if need be. So launching right into our first poll, just out of curiosity, I would love to know if there's a primary entry point from your perspective as a listener into this webinar. So whether it's network theory or the collective impact model or something else. So Melinda, I'll just give a second to send that out, and if everyone can quickly click their option, and Melinda will let us know the results. I'm not sure if those have come through to everyone. And if not, actually, that's okay. I might actually just keep going while that poll's running. And Melinda, you can just signal to me when those results are through.
Oh, sure. Yep, they are, and I shared them, so they might pop up on your screen, at least as a participant. So it looks like we have 48% that said collective impact was the entry point, 36% network theory, and 16% said other.
Oh, great. Okay, so a good mix. That's super. Thanks, everyone. That sort of helps me get a sense of who's on the line, and it's almost a split, so that's great. And just to be clear on this first slide about my perspective, as Danielle mentioned, I've done a lot of different work in a lot of different places, but this webinar really comes from, what I'm about to share comes from the perspective of a practitioner. So we've spent a lot of time trying to learn as much as we can about the theory and the articles and all the literature on both collective impact and network theory. I am by no means an expert on any of it, but this is just sort of the story of us trying to make it work in our context. So in terms of that context, what is the First 2000 Days Network? Essentially, we're defined as a collective response of community members, organizations, professionals, with a passion for making progress on our vision, which is all around early childhood development, that children from conception to age 6 are supported by their family and community to reach their optimal development. And I know there's a lot of work going on in the world around early childhood right now. Why 2000 Days Network? Well, essentially there's 2000 days in a child's life between birth and by the time they enter kindergarten or the school system in a formal way. And according to the research of the Palix Foundation and the Alberta Centre for Child and Family Wellness, 85% of the brain's wiring occurs in those first 2000 days. So it is a critical period for us as society to ensure that that period of life is sustained in a way that those children can then thrive. Our purpose statement as a network is that we act as a catalyst for linking, aligning, and leveraging efforts in the early childhood system to enable collective action toward improving ECD outcomes. And if you sort of parse that purpose statement out, you come up with about 9 sub-definitions. What does linking mean? What does aligning mean? What does leveraging mean? What is early childhood development? How do we define collective action? And then what are ECD outcomes? So it's a very thick and dense idea, and part of our process has been to sort of figure that out. We are very clear as a network. We are, first of all, not a funder, and we do not deliver programs and services. And when we're asked about what we are, sometimes we answer with that first, with what we're not. And that actually opens up a space for people to go, well, if you're not a funder and you don't have programs and services, what on earth are you? And that's when we can enter into this conversation about really being a catalyst for collective work. We have a strong focus on evaluation at our network, partly because of, I guess, my personal bias around the importance of evaluation from all sides, but also just because we were starting in kind of a very messy context. So we developed a theory of change to help guide our efforts, and that is that if we're able to build on momentum within the ECD space in Calgary through our purpose of linking, aligning, and leveraging what's already working, we will eventually have better outcomes at the system, agency, and community level, which would ultimately mean better outcomes for children in the long run. And a lot of our ability to be confident in this theory of change was actually reinforced through our work with the folks at the University of Denver, Colorado, specifically the research of Dr. Darren Hicks around collaborative processes and the link between essentially strength of collaboration and ultimate outcomes. So we thank them very much for reinforcing or supporting our theory of change. These are a few of the foundational documents we've drawn on in order to design our initiative. So some of the stuff lots of you will be familiar with, all the work from FSG on the collective impact and backbone, and certainly Tamarack here in Canada plays a large role in that. The Network Weaver Handbook from June Hawley, the work of Janice Pope and colleagues on the Interorganizational Networks document, There's also something from the Monitor Institute, Catalyzing Networks for Social Change, which I'll reference, and then some other things specific to early years and early childhood development. And of course, the work at the University of Denver through the partner tool and their deep knowledge of networks. So a little bit about networks for those of you who are coming from the collective impact side, and a little bit about collective impact for those of you who are coming from the network side, and hopefully those of you who are coming from the quote-unquote other side will also find this useful. So the first 2,000 days is a network, and what that means is that we have a different mindset in terms of how we approach ultimately our development. And this graph is from the Monitor Institute's Catalyzing Networks for Social Change, and it just describes the difference between essentially traditional metrics for what's working versus what a network mindset would say. And the big one on the bottom that's underlined, the trusting relationships and open information flows, is something we've taken very seriously. And one of the questions we asked ourselves was, how do you know if you have trusting relationships? And we'll show you, and I'll talk a little bit about how we found out. This is also from the Monitor Institute document, talking about how to develop a network, knowing it, knitting it, organizing it, growing it, transitioning or transforming it, and that continuous cycle. And that it really takes a village to make that happen, and it's never finished. One of the sort of prerequisites, I think, for network leadership is a high degree of comfort with discomfort and uncertainty. There are a lot of moving parts, especially where we're starting with a more organic network than a mandated network, which is a huge difference essentially in starting point. So we really take an ecological approach to our development, and we've built in redundancies in all of these steps deliberately. So those who are engaged in the network are engaged in all of these simultaneously, which also has told us something about the kind of people we're attracting into the network, or sort of people that can handle doing all of this at once. Network types and functions. This is pulled from the document that was referenced earlier, Interorganizational Networks, done by the IBM Center for the Business of Government. And I'm not going to go into this in any detail. It's in the document, but there's different types of networks, and each of them has a different function. And what does that mean when you're often merging those different types and functions together within a certain context? And that's something we're still trying to work with and work out. So at this point, for those of you who know something about collective impact, I would just love to get a sense of where you would put yourself on this sort of spectrum of development of a collective impact initiative. So there'll probably be another poll pop up for you. And I've adapted this language from the strivetogether.org's theory of action framework. But essentially there's 4 main stages there, and I just love to get a sense of where people self-identify. And then Melinda, whenever you have some data.
I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. So if you haven't put your response in, I'll give it maybe 3 more seconds. If you could go ahead and do that. We have almost everyone has responded, 62 out of 79. So I'll just give it a few more seconds. So the results that I have here are we have 43% that are in the exploring stage, 46% that are in the emerging stage, 3% in the sustaining, and then 8% in the systems change impact.
Wow, that's great. For those of you that are in the systems change impact, please get in touch with me so we can talk. I'd love to know more about your work. That's exciting. Yeah, I'd say the first 2,000 days network is in the exploring emerging stage. But of course, like with any scale, it's all context specific. So there are some things that sort of fall in all of these categories and tend to shift, frankly, based on a shifting landscape. So thanks for everyone for that. So most of you know this, the 5 conditions of collective impact: common agenda, shared measurement, mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, and backbone support. And this graph essentially shows at a very high level how we've approached the links between a network approach and the collective impact approach. So what's the language in the network literature that maps over the collective impact literature? So you'll see under shared measurement, from a network approach, there's things like intangibles that are called intangibles in the collective impact literature around trust and reciprocity and a learning culture, and even some of the leadership characteristics that the collective impact literature speaks to. How do you get a sense of those things as part of essentially a broader learning approach? So we'll get into that. Part of how we see ourselves is that the collective impact model essentially informs the what of what our network is up to. So we are using the collective impact framework to map out the sort of functional activities that we need to pay attention to. And then the network theory and the network approach really informs how we do that. And both of those things impact our network's structure. So this is very oversimplified, but it really has been a bit of a light bulb moment for us, because we were trying to figure out what these 2 approaches have to do with each other, and this has made it clear for us. And in terms of network leadership, which is part of the work that Danielle and her team do with the conference and bringing people together around that specific idea, it's very distributed in our case. So the idea of organizing the network or building increased capacity to guide and support and lead the network falls amongst a team of people. And based on their existing relationships and their existing involvement in the early childhood development sector, certainly in Calgary, they take on different roles at different times. At the center, however, is this idea of building dedicated, but also increasing levels of resources, responsibility, and capacity within all of us. So that's really our driving ethos behind our network leadership and what we've built into our backbone, what the collective impact literature would call backbone support. And I've just put a bunch of things that go into the backbone from our perspective. It's not only strategy and large-scale sort of evaluation efforts, it's also cooking lasagnas and printing name tags, which we all take on as a way to contribute. I should say the network doesn't have a sort of conventional backbone structure, the first 2,000 days network, and I'll explain that in a minute. We really have a very capable but motley crew of folks who jump into to meeting the needs of the functions of the backbone. We certainly don't see the backbone as a specific organization or even certain distinct roles. We haven't approached it that way. So what are we learning as a result of all this? The first thing we're learning is to start with culture. I'm sure many of you have seen this quote before, but fish don't know they're in water, and we're often not aware of the cultures we're swimming in. So we've been very deliberate about focusing on culture that will actually support our strategy, and part of that's just modeling the kind of behaviors we're striving for, which is in an adaptive learning culture. being very, very open and tolerant of failure and on redoing the thing that you thought you knew you should be doing over and over and over again. That's very uncomfortable for funders who are used to efficiencies in certain ways. But we can't see sort of any other honest way of doing this work. So we've really tried to stick to our guns around what we need to do to support that sort of adaptive learning space. This image is from our evaluation framework. So it talks about what is a culture of adaptive learning, what kinds of high-level processes need to be in place, what does continuous learning mean. The language that Danielle and her team would use is continuous quality improvement. How do you do that? What does that mean? So our evaluation framework is about 20 pages of images like this with supporting narrative, but this is the first one we start with, just to sort of set the stage. We also have guiding principles for our network. These are based on the research of Darren Hicks and Janice Pope and others, and certainly Danielle. So trusting, collaborative, participatory, authentic, transparent, and adaptive. And we just try as much as we can to model those behaviors as much as we do communicate them. There's obviously, we're all aware of the huge gap between codes of conduct and actual behavior within organizations. So we're trying to always keep an eye on how do you close that gap between sort of stated ideals and actual behavior. So this is more of a process toward guiding principles. It's not a destination or a stated end state at all. The other thing we've learned is that systems thinking is really hard, but part of our role in being a network and a collective impact initiative is actually to build capacity for just that, because if we're trying to change a system, we need to understand it. And part of the challenge is that we all see parts of the system and think we understand the whole. So how as a network do we guide our collective ability to see more of the system? The challenge and the risk in all of this, of course, is if I think the system is a sphere, for instance, like according to this image, and I go about designing solutions based on my understanding that the system is a sphere, that could seriously undermine the efforts of someone else in the system who thinks it's a rope and is designing solutions to impact the system from that perspective. So systems are complex, but we can figure them out. We know how to do that. And part of it, I think, is recognizing that we're all trying to not only intervene, but contribute to improving a system that we need to admit we don't fully understand. So how do we work together to increase that understanding? This is a little bit more on our evaluation approach and our learning approach. So our second huge lesson in all of this was to assess early, often, and on multiple fronts. And what does that mean? So this is a very, this makes it seem simple, this slide. It is decidedly not simple, but we have a few tools at our disposal for our assessments and our ongoing learning process. So we have something we're calling internal collective impact capacity. We developed internally a collective impact maturity scorecard, which we pull out and assess ourselves against periodically. It essentially takes all of the preconditions and conditions for collective impact that have been mentioned in the literature, and we just assess ourselves against whether or not we do that or not. Useful, very useful internal tool, especially from a backbone or network leadership perspective, to see where those gaps are. And to be honest, that some things will always be red. Internal network functioning. So the graph you see there is actually a product of our work with Danielle and her team to conduct a network analysis on the first 2,000 days network. And these are essentially the goal statements or the outcome statements that we said we would achieve. And then we asked our network whether or not we were contributing to actually achieving those. So we have some sort of process to know how we're doing as a network. We also have a developmental evaluation process that's separate from that. External network effectiveness. So do our partners value us? Do they trust us? Is our process transparent and deemed authentic? Those are some other indicators we receive from the network analysis project that we completed. And then we also have the external shared measurement, which is part of the collective impact model. We have chosen as a network to think through the shared measurement piece using something called the Strengthening Families framework out of the Center for the Study of Social Policy. I could do an entire webinar on how we're using that as our shared measure and why we chose it, which I'm happy to do or have a conversation with anyone who's interested. But that's essentially our shared measurement approach, which links ultimately to outcomes for our desired social issue, which is early childhood development. So that's an example of how we embed learning and the tools we use to learn with. Never underestimate the impact of history. So all initiatives have a provenance. Even if they're new, they have a provenance and a history behind them. And it's important to understand sort of the developmental path that led up to the creation of any endeavor, because there's lots of underlying levers at play, as I'm sure most of you will recognize. So this is an image, a historical image of the network as it was initially conceived. So we had something called ECMAP, which is over here, which is basically neighborhood level early childhood coalitions that were funded by the Alberta government to engage in early childhood development solutions for their local community. We also had the great work that was being done by the United Way of Calgary and area through their Upstart initiative, and they had 3 priority teams that were working in the early child care space, or early childhood development space. We had an organization called Calgary Reads, which was involved in some way in both of these and brought everyone together and said, you know, what if we incubated this idea of a network? What if instead of us having a million meetings with each other in 2 different contexts, if we all actually met under a single context? And that's when the collective impact framework was brought forward, and also the network theory. I should say that the United Way of Calgary and area was working quite strongly in the collective impact area. And so we inherited a lot from them, which you'll see here. So this is sort of how we came to be. We have this community development and this baseline data from the community coalitions work. They were using the early development instrument to measure early childhood school readiness, essentially. We have the common agenda and the collective impact piece coming from the work of the United Way. And then we have the network approach and essentially leadership and stewardship from the organization, the Calgary Reads organization, which brought all this together. So we have a lot of history here, and the network didn't sort of appear out of a vacuum. Part of our challenge has been to not only honor that history, but also try and improve on it. And we mention this just because it is a huge learning, and it has impacted our ability to continue and to keep engaging those stakeholders. Adapt. In complex adaptive systems, you can't be a static response. That's just a fundamental truth. So the next few slides walk us through our own thinking about ourselves as a network, but also as a collective impact initiative. So you'll see here a merging of the collective impact language and the network language. So initially we were asked, you know, where do you fit? And we started calling ourselves the bridge between these systemic level early childhood initiatives and those that were essentially organizational level players. We left the sort of those parents and caregivers who are directly impacting children and children. They were not sort of directly connected to the network. We were trying to create a bridge here between these 2 systems. And that actually impacted how we think about our structure. So we think of ourselves, you know, these functions of the backbone sit in the middle, and we have representatives from the backbone who lead and connect to what we're calling network change leads. So people who are represented within change collectives in the community around specific issues related to early childhood that then feed back into the backbone. So that meets sort of the continuous communication criteria of collective impact. It also, these change collectives are essentially people who have identified as working on mutually reinforcing activities. And then the backbone functions are met. The shared measurement approach we're using is that strengthening families piece. So as a backbone, we're using that to sort of guide our knowing whether we're accomplishing what we said we would for children. And then we have this graph, which is another way of looking at how we operate, which is to say that the network, or a network of early childhood initiatives in our case, is way, way, way broader than what the first 2,000 Days network can interact with. So there is a language, potential language confusion around using the word network, because people see themselves as part of an early childhood development network, whether or not they're part of the first 2,000 Days network. And that was an important thing for us to A, recognize, B, be honest with ourselves, and C, get a handle on, because it created confusion, first of all. And second of all, there's no way the network can impact everyone who sees themselves as part of this broader community. So this graph was just to make that distinction, that we're trying to create essentially wisdom within the community with those we interact with, but the network is always much broader than we are. Other learnings, these are sort of, they come from a few different angles, so I'll just pull them off one at a time. Collaboration is not consensus. And when we say that, everyone goes, yeah, of course not. but I think there's an underlying assumption when we don't stop and think about it, that they are the same. And that's just clearly not possible. This is actually our network analysis map from the team, from the partner tool at Denver. There's no way we should strive for consensus. Collective impact is not even about consensus, even if there's a common agenda. The consensus is around the long-term or broad level vision, but how people are going to get there and what they need to get there from where they're starting today is all over the map. And so being really clear about the capacity that we have to influence that in any way is part of our growing pains. And we're really working hard to figure that out. Another thing that we always try and keep in mind is that the network map, all of these nodes, yellow, green, purple, whatever, they're all people. They are human beings who have families and jobs and passions, and they're entering into the network with their own sense of what's important and why, and we need to be able to work with that complexity. Our shared measurement, I alluded to this before, but our shared measurement drives our strategy and not the other way around. So this is a distinct way that we've interpreted the collective impact model. We actually see the shared measurement component driving the other components of the collective impact framework. So we won't know what mutually reinforcing activities, we won't know what communication, we won't know what kind of backbone functions we should focus on or build capacity around if we don't know what we're trying to essentially measure. This is sort of launching us down a really interesting path for the next little while to try and map this out and truly deeply understand what this means. But it is key in our personality as a network. This is really important.
Hey, Blythe, I'm just going to interrupt for just a second to remind everyone that Blythe will be finishing up in just a minute or two, and then we want to open it up for questions. So if you have a question, go ahead and go to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and type it in there, and then in just a few minutes we'll start doing a facilitated Q&A to get those answered. So go ahead, Blythe.
Great, thanks. Yeah, we're almost done here. So this is just a slide to remind me and all of us who are involved in the network to pay attention to organizational maturity, and to be really aware of those sort of stages of organizational maturity and how they impact your ability to build out a network or a collective impact initiative. The work from strivetogether.org has been extremely helpful in us thinking through what this could look like and some best practice ideas on even just language. It's been extremely a great resource for us. So thanks to all the folks there who make that so available. And a lot of us have been talking about this idea of social innovation who are in this space, and what does that mean? And there's this assumption that innovation is all positive or only has positive impacts. There's a really sort of positive association with the word innovation, especially in social change. But innovation is hard. And if we're starting out like we did as a network, essentially thinking of ourselves, based on our historical context, if we self-identified as being birds and we see that we need to move towards acting as a city, there's some common patterns there, but that looks a lot different. And that means that players are going to fall off the table. Some are not going to have the capacity to make that kind of change for all kinds of really good reasons. What happens at a systems level is either going to enable or constrain our ability to do this. And we've experienced even in our own network, groups have come apart. Funding has disappeared. Initiatives have collapsed. And that's impacted people's jobs even. So it's a hard process towards social change, and maybe reminding ourselves of that every now and then and giving ourselves a little bit of space to be okay with that is a good idea. And capacity development, I think everything around collective impact and network leadership is ultimately about building capacity. And then we have to start answering the question, capacity to do what? And that'll be different for all of us, but it's an important, I think, focus. And that change is slow to be prepared. This is one of my favorite quotes. If I had 20 days to solve a problem, I would take 19 days to define it. And that has certainly been true for us. We've had lots of pressure to go faster, to be more efficient, to come up with solutions, to especially pressure to, quote unquote, take action, do something. What can we do? And my assessment is that there's a lot of stuff that's being done. And certainly in our sector, there's a lot more than out there than parents can and children, frankly, can handle in terms of options, which is on one hand amazing. But on the other hand, if it's not actually changing the social issue in the end, is taking another new action really what's needed, or is an assessment of our current actions and an attempt to leverage what's already working, maybe a more wise investment of our time? So we also try not to forget about why we're doing all this. It is about kids and building adaptive and resilient little human beings. So I'm very lucky to be able to do this work. I work with such an amazing group of people who've helped make this all happen. So if they're listening, a huge thanks out to them. And we'll turn it over to questions.
Okay, thanks so much, Blythe. As always, I learn something from you every time I hear you speak. We do have quite a few questions, so we'll get started on them. The first one is a question about funding. So who's funding the first 2,000 Days initiative? And related to that, what are the incentives for groups and individuals to invest in the network? Is it just a belief in the vision, or are there funding and resources for that?
Okay, so great question. So we have an initial grant from an anonymous donor here in Calgary and area who has funded us under their innovation strategy. So we have basically received funding for our initial stage to essentially test whether or not we can set the preconditions for collective impact. And that's actually quite important. I would say we are not a collective impact initiative yet. We are setting the preconditions so that that might be possible. We also have support from United Way. We have support from the Calgary Foundation. We have lots and lots of support in kind and sort of morally from Calgary Reads and the folks there, and a lot of other organizations who've come to the table over the course of time. There's a lot of in-kind contributions, especially people's time. Right now, we have no extrinsic funding for those who participate. We try to be very clear on the kind of support we can provide them in terms of capacity building, in terms of linking with others who are doing similar work. And our selection strategy is essentially self-selection. So we think if we can be as clear as we can about what we are able to offer, which is not money, then people will self-select in, which is a very inefficient way to develop. But it's what we can do at this point. Okay,
Great. So we have a couple of people asking about the collective impact maturity scorecard. So I'm wondering, some folks said they actually missed the description of that, and folks are wondering also if you can share it.
Yes, sure. Happy to share it. It was essentially, it actually came out of trying to think through what the preconditions for collective impact might be based on the literature. And I literally did basically a lit review and created a spreadsheet because I'm a bit of a geek and score red, yellow, or green based on our assessment of where we're at against those preconditions for collective impact. So yeah, happy, my email's here. If you're interested in learning more about that, I'm happy to sort of walk through it. It's, you know, it's a bit crude, frankly, but it works for us. So, yeah.
So and here's another interesting question. Do you see a difference between community development and collective impact?
Well, I guess that depends on your definition of community development. I think community development could be a mechanism to contribute to collective impact, but I don't see them as the same. And I think everything sort of starts with an assessment of current state and current capacity. So there is a huge community development component, especially in our case, because we started with those neighborhood coalitions who were created expressly as a community development initiative. So we have a huge, you know, part of our personality comes from community development, but it's not only that, no.
Right, okay. So the next set of questions I would kind of put into two categories, some about process and then a few about measurement. So one question asks, do you consider various groups that are local and addressing the problems and issues that you're concerned with as an individual network in your overall effort, or do you consider them a network of networks? So I think the question is, how are you kind of leveraging existing networks into this larger effort of networks of networks?
Right, great. Okay, good question. So part of it is allowing those who play a role in the backbone functions, like essentially the backbone team, if you want to call it something, is that they are, back to that pink slide here, I'll go back. They are essentially leaders of their own networks. And so we try to leverage their existing, essentially, natural authority in their own communities and have just a feedback loop, a more sort of structured feedback loop to the broader network. So there are people who are part of these sort of what we're calling change collective who might not self-identify as being part of the first 2000 days network, but because they're linked to someone who does link with us, we can at least know that they're there. It's very, very, like, we're early days, and that's part of our next phase of engagement, is to potentially bring a little bit more rigor around how we do that.
Right. Okay. So So a couple questions actually about measurement. So I'll start with this one. How do you get a baseline assessment of a community as you're doing this work? Have you all had experiences doing that?
A very interesting question. So there's baseline that then begs the question, baseline of what? So
Yeah.
part of the work of the ECMAP or those community coalitions was to administer something called the EDI, which is the Early Development Instrument, which is used globally to measure school readiness and early childhood development outcomes. So we had an amazing project here in Alberta that administered a baseline, that essentially got baseline data using the EDI on how well our children are doing in Alberta. And it's dismal, frankly. And it's the first time the province has had that data. Strive Together also uses EDI as their quote-unquote shared measure for their early years component of their collective impact strategy. We looked at that tool. It's a population level measure. It's a very long-term measure. It's the way that the data is analyzed. You know, there's sort of a mean distribution. We felt as a small, basically, initiative with very limited resources that, you know, using the EDI as our quote-unquote baseline would not be realistic. We just don't have the capacity to map to that, and it doesn't make sense. So that's where we landed on the strengthening families. We don't have a baseline quote-unquote measure for who might map into the strengthening families approach. That's the road we're going down now. We do have a baseline now on the health of our network because of the work we did with the partner tool. So we know things like trust scores and value scores and who feels they're contributing what and what goals we're achieving and what goals we're not. So we do have some of that baseline data on process outcomes. We're still early days in terms of baseline data for outcomes for kids.
Great. And so actually along those lines, someone asked if you have a set process or tool to perform network analysis, and do you have any recommendations for how to get started mapping networks? Maybe I'll let you answer. I mean, for sure I'll let you answer. I can add something if you need help.
I would definitely talk to Danielle. That's the answer I would give. And we had done a lot of digging. We'd asked around what that looks like, and you can certainly sort of do a systems map of your network on flip charts in an afternoon with some key stakeholders. Like there's that level of just knowing who's who and how they're connected. But the network analysis that Danielle and her team and the tool offer, so it's called the partner tool, is quite robust and has a lot of history behind it. And so Danielle, if you want to add something.
Only one thing. You can find it at partnertool.net. And also on our next webinar on February 18th, we'll be discussing that in a lot of depth. So you can find out a lot more about it then too. But Blythe, there's another question, and I'm not sure well, let me ask it to you. So this is a question from an evaluator from Toronto who's involved in a collective impact program while using gamification to identify different types of players and their role in the network. And it says, the question is, can you kindly guide me to some existing research or examples to look into? I'm not sure what gamification is, so I'm not sure if you do, but maybe you could answer that better.
No, the closest thing I've heard of is a colleague of mine. I think I don't know much about it. I know some institutions are going into that world to do that work, but we have not done that, and I think it would be out of our ability from a resource perspective, frankly. But well, it sounds interesting to learn more.
Yeah, so the person who asked that question, you should get back in touch with us. I think we'd all love to learn more about it. Maybe it's one of our future webinars, actually. So, So sorry, we couldn't add more resources for you on that. So we really only have time for this last question, but it's kind of a question about governance of the first 2,000 Days Networks. The question is, how do you make decisions?
Great question. We actually need another webinar on that.
Yeah.
When I started with the network, they were using the constellation model of governance, which has a stewardship group, which is essentially a board, and has a secretariat, which is essentially staff, and then it has sort of, you know, this cloud out there of nodes and the community. And we just felt that where we were at, it was too early for something that structured, and we were doing it for the sake of saying we had one, which is not the right reason for doing anything. So we actually collapsed it. We're still in touch with those stewardship group members. We rely on them all the time for advice. We try and keep them in the loop. Our backbone team is essentially the same as the secretariat was 3 years ago, you know, give or take. So we have all those structures in place. They're just not formalized, and we don't force people to meet monthly for the sake of it. The decision-making process is as diverse as the challenges we're trying to address. So how we make decisions about certain things changes depending on what it is we're trying to figure out. And I know that's not the answer maybe you were looking for, but that's just how it works for us right now anyway.
Nice. Okay, well, we're just at the top of the hour again, so I just want to express my thanks, and I'm sure everyone on the call's thanks to you, Blythe, for sharing so much of this with us. I can tell there's so many different things that we could talk to you about and ask questions about, and if there's something I've learned about Blythe is she loves to talk about this and she loves sharing. And so please contact Blythe. Here's her information right here on the slide. And any of us at the University of Colorado, Denver in the network leadership team, we would love to continue these conversations, especially your questions, and we're always interested in what people are trying to learn about. So we look forward to staying connected with everyone and hopefully seeing you on our next webinar. So thank you to everyone, and at this time we're going to close our meeting, and we hope that you all have a great weekend. Thank you. Thank you, Blythe.
Thanks, Danielle. Thanks for the opportunity.